Welcome. This week on Security and Compliance Weekly, we're talking to Matt Springfield. He is the founder of a company called 12 Feet Incorporated. Matt spends most of his time focused on providing highly experienced consulting, focusing on get your drinks in hands, PCI compliance, enterprise vulnerability management, and cloud security and compliance for some of the world's largest companies. We're going to focus our conversation with Matt today on his recent experiences with migrating things to the cloud and talk about things like how that impacts PCI and other compliance standards. Hopefully, he'll give us some advice on the do's and the don'ts. We'll talk about some compliance responsibilities, who has them and when and where. And probably more importantly, the liability shifts, if any, that is associated with companies migrating to the cloud. In our second segment, we are going to talk security and compliance news, but we're going to focus on cloud security related topics. And Matt has graciously agreed to stay with us and provide color commentary during that segment. So join us as we continue our journey of tearing down silos and building bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome to episode 33 of Security and Compliance Weekly, recorded on the last day of June. That's June 30th. And it's also the last day of the first half of probably the most forgettable year on record, 2020. I'm your host, Mr. Jeff Mann, and joining me today virtually and definitely socially distanced are co-hosts, Mr. Matt Alderman, Mr. Josh Marpet, and Mr. Scott Lyons. Gentlemen, welcome.
Hola.
Thank you.
What's going on?
I feel like we haven't done this in a while.
Only two.
Well, we had last week off.
Yeah, we had a break.
We did have a break.
Somebody had to run a CTF virtually for InfoSec World. Somebody had to run a Container Security Summit virtually for InfoSec World. You know.
Right, well, but today's topics are going to be a lot of fun. So we're going to make up for it.
We will. Hey, before we jump into our conversation, do have a couple quick announcements. Number one, join the Security Weekly mailing list and receive your invite to our community Discord server by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and clicking the button to join the list. Also, in our first July webcast, you will learn how to stitch and enrich flow data for security with Viavi Solutions. Register for our upcoming webcasts or virtual trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/webcasts. Of course, you can also find previously recorded webcasts by visiting securityweekly.com/on-demand. All right, enough of that. So, today we're joined, as I mentioned in the preview, by a gentleman named Mr. Matt Springfield. Full disclosure, Matt and I have actually known each other for, I think it's been about 13 years. Does that sound about right, Matt?
Correct.
And
seems
welcome,
like 20.
of course. That's because it's been all PCI. Matt and I actually used to work together at the same PCI practice with a little company called VeriSign, and which later our practice got moved over to another little company called AT&T. Matt was liberated shortly thereafter, and it took me a few years, but we both escaped the Borg, as some of us used to refer to it. But that's not aspersions to AT&T or its big blue marble logo. Anyway, Matt, you're still doing stuff PCI related? I thought I was the only one.
Yes, still in the recovering QSA status.
Hi, my name is Jeff, and I'm a QSA.
But I'm not a QSA. I'm not qualified.
Yeah, because
that's why you're in recovery as he downs his drink.
Yep, that's why I drink. Well, Matt, how'd you get started in security, and I guess more pointedly, how did you fall into PCI?
So I've been one of the few that's been in the industry like us old timers here. I'm about 23 years in, and one of the companies that I started back in the mid 90s, we were a service provider, and we actually provided consulting services for, at that point, dial-up service providers and things of that nature. And just through fate, we wound up getting very security centric. Did some work for some FBI search functions, highly classified data, things of that nature. And then just kind of bounced around ever since. In the early 2000s, I ran security for a larger service provider organization where we began the process of becoming KISP certified, if you recall those days. It's Visa's Cardholder Information Security Program. And that's where I kind of started with the compliance functions of how we are merging compliance and technologies together. So, and then I think, weren't we in the original very first QSA training in 2006?
That sounds about right. No, I wasn't in the I wasn't in the first one. If that was, wow, gosh, maybe it was. I've got the training book for my first course back there, and I don't remember where I thought it was in Dallas, but maybe I'm wrong. It's a long time ago. I might have been the second one, I think, but second one for you, first one for me.
Gotcha.
Anyway,
yeah, and so I just continued on with that, and as you mentioned before, after I think 6 years of doing QSA work, and a lot of the work that I focused on during that time was architectural work, helping clients build environments, helping clients correct environments that needed correction or remediation, and so kind of continued on with that path once I left AT&T.
So, Matt, you were doing network segmentation to isolate the scope of PCI?
Oh, yeah, that's one of the many things, yeah. But you don't.
Yeah, we were doing that before it was actually written down as a thing that you could do or should do.
Yeah. What's the button?
Oh, so since Matt and I used to work together, and I am a native of the Washington, D.C. area and a lifelong Redskins fan, and Matt and our old boss, who I think we've interviewed on Paul Security Weekly before, Brandon Williams, they live down in Dallas, so we used to like to razz on each other, and they used to pick on me when the Redskins would lose to the Cowboys, and once in a blue moon I got to pick on them when the Redskins would beat the Cowboys. So I've had this button as a lifelong Redskins fan, and I wore it in honor of Mr. Springfield.
Right. We'll go with that.
In honor of, not to like, and
right.
push his buttons. Totally not to.
Oh, hey, before we get too far into it, Matt, we like to ask all of our guests what we call the hot seat question. And it's an open-ended question. There's no right or wrong answer. We're just trying to get it's like one of those icebreaker type questions at youth camp. But, what is your take? Where do you fall in the what we call the continuum of the space between security and compliance? What's your take on security versus compliance, basically, is what we like to ask.
Oh, that is a hot seat question. So, I spend a lot of my time clearly in the compliance area, but what I try to do is I try to ensure that we're checking the boxes that we need to be checking, but we're getting security value out of the approach that we have in order to check that box. And that's something that I do think is hugely lacking in some of the compliance standards that we have, which is they're not able to evolve as fast as the technology stacks are evolving. The development stacks and all of those kind of things are changing so fast they can't change. But the question is how can you meet that standard by providing some level of security value in doing so? Because it doesn't do us much good to waste money and resources on just checking a box. So there is a huge difference in compliance and security. But depending upon the path that you take, you should be able to get security value out of the compliance controls that you're implementing.
Okay. I understand completely what you're saying, and probably because we used to work together and we worked for an organization or a group that, we were all sort of the same mind, trying to bring value. And really the way I looked at it was a lot of our customers, or at least my customers, they didn't really understand what the question or the requirement was for the box that they were checking. So I would spend most of my time just trying to explain what it meant in the context of their environment, of their business operations. And if I was lucky, hopefully, but at the end of the day, they'd say, oh yeah, that makes sense. We should do that.
Yeah.
I found it fascinating that your comments were about business focused and dollars focused. That you said, you've got to use your dollars wisely. I'm paraphrasing, forgive me. And you've got to make sure that you get value out of the compliance dollars you spend and get some security value out of it. And so you're tying together of the dollars spent, the compliance value and the security value. I thought were very good. And it's a viewpoint that I think a lot of people could use.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think there is a lack of business understanding, or at least business focus in a lot of the decisions that we have from a security perspective, especially when compliance is brought into the discussion, because a lot of times people look at it as a compliance tax. I know I have to do it. I'm gonna have to spend those dollars, but again, the challenge is, can we get other value out of those dollars spent?
So I have a question for you, Matt. Based on the companies that you've worked for and with over the years, working particularly with PCI, where do you see the breakout in terms of organizational structure, in terms of basically, who's calling the shots or who's spending the dollars? Are there distinct security groups, compliance groups, audit groups, GRC groups, and whatever? Have you seen that at work and or not working? Give us a little take on that.
Sure. Yeah, it depends on the two things. It depends on the focus of the organization, what the organization is, if they're a merchant or if they're a service provider, and what the drivers are behind that. And then that's going to influence usually who has the responsibility for it. So I'll give you an example. On the merchant side of things, it depends on the size of the organization, but we tend to see security is, from my customer's point of view, security is generally driving the discussion and decisions for the merchants. On the service provider side, and when I say service provider, I'm specifically talking about organizations that provide like cloud compute type of services. So think Verizon or AWS or Microsoft or Azure. Okay. That drive is generally business driven, and it comes from sales. So a lot of those organizations have their own security department, but what drives their need to have compliance is they need to show an AOC to a customer. So I have seen the service provider realm span from it's security driven all the way through to it is completely driven by sales, and sales is actually reaching out and running the assessments and engaging the third parties.
Hey, for the benefit
there is
of
a variability there.
I'm sorry. For the benefit of our audience that may not be conversant in PCI speak, what does AOC mean?
Attestation of compliance. And if, given today's topic, if you are looking at moving PCI resources to a cloud provider, that is very much something that you would want to seek out. So it is basically each service provider has their own PCI assessment. And as a part of that PCI assessment, they include in their attestation of compliance what services were assessed and deemed compliant to PCI for that service provider's product or service portfolio.
But Matt, that's only a subset of some of the PCI controls, though, because a cloud provider can't provide necessarily all the control requirements in PCI. So it's a subset. So how do you determine what the AOC covers, right, versus what you still have to do as a client to make sure all 12 requirements of PCI are met?
Yeah, it's a great call out, and I know something that Jeff has definitely run across is the perception of, well, I'm using Amazon and they're compliant, so I'm compliant and I'm good, and that's really a false perception. It's still incumbent upon the merchant. It's their responsibility to ensure that the services that they are using, in combination with the processes that they have as an organization, are resulting in a compliant overall PCI solution. So I'll give you an example of that. Amazon has, and the rest of the cloud providers have, a list of services on their AOC that are deemed to be compliant. But in the cloud realm, we have their stuff, we have our stuff, and then there's stuff that we both manage in the middle. So in the case of
shared responsibility model.
Correct, exactly. And they are required per PCI requirements to document out what that responsibility matrix look like. For a given service or a given requirement, we've got this taken care of, or it is the responsibility of the merchant to take care of. And then, so it really depends on the actual service that you're using. It depends on which portions of the responsibility are shifted. So the number one thing is that for a given merchant's merchant ID that they're responsible for all transactions, all card numbers that are getting processed under a merchant's merchant ID, it is that merchant's responsibility for compliance for that flow. I may use services from, let's say, Amazon or Azure or Google or whoever that are helping me in that flow. So if I'm using a cloud database, that is a platform as a service, meaning that we don't operate that database, we consume that database. Then
can I nitpick you 1 second, Matt, on what you just said?
Away.
So from a merchant perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, but technically from the card brand's perspective, it's not the merchant that's on the hook, it's the merchant's bank that's on the hook, who in turn puts pressure on the merchant to comply with PCI.
You're very correct. And that is because that responsibility piece goes upstream step by step. So it goes from the merchant to the acquirer, which is what you're speaking of. And the acquirer is responsible for reporting compliance of all of their merchants to the brands.
To the card brands themselves, which can get a little bit fuzzy. And I had a little hiatus away from PCI when I was off in vendor land working for General Network Security. And when I came back, what used to be fairly well-defined, if not still misunderstood, there's levels of merchants, there's levels of service providers. It seems like, and Visa, I'm citing Visa particularly because they sort of seem to lead the regulations or the compliance with the regulations, or who needs to do what in terms of the PCI regulations. They seem to have sort of rebranded, if you will, the whole service provider concept. And have you encountered that? I mean, I have my take on it, but I don't think you had the hiatus. So I'd rather hear from you what you see as sort of the evolution. I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but what you see as the evolution of understanding of the role of a service provider, and in particular, cloud providers.
Yeah, as you go back in time, service provider's been very. It's been one of those definitions that really you have to look at because it brings a lot of things in scope for what is classified as a service provider. So by the definition, a service provider is any third-party vendor that can impact the security of your cardholder data. That can be a janitor service that's working on your data center. Or it can be a cloud service provider where they're processing my cardholder data, or my cardholder data is transitioning across that environment. So it's a very wide range.
To put it in terms that it might resonate with some people, some of our listening audience. It could be an HVAC company that has access to your environment to control the temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Never saw that attack coming. Oh, sorry. Matt, I want to go back. You were talking about RDS. You were giving an example, right? And I think that's a great example. I want to pick on this a little bit because let's say RDS is PCI compliant according to AWS. But I, as the merchant, decide not to turn on encryption at rest, or I misconfigure the RDS service. This is where things get really interesting, I think, from a PCI perspective, because the service is PCI compliant if configured correctly, but if the merchant doesn't do it correctly, then they're not in compliance anymore, which means you can't just, as a merchant, you can't just hand the stuff off to the cloud provider and say, "Oh, I'm done with it."
Yeah, and that goes back to the perception that we were talking about earlier. Just because I'm using this service and the service is compliant does not make your solution on that service compliant. So you're exactly right. And that's where we see a perfect extension to that example is, so I'm using this database service, but I'm putting clear text cardholder data in it, and I'm not fulfilling my requirements under Section 3 of the standard that says that I have to encrypt that data. But I'm using a compliant service, but how I'm using it is not compliant. And that really applies to all service consumption under public cloud models. Is they have a whole host of compliant solutions, but how you use it is very important. How you consume that service is important for compliance.
You know, I have a lot of clients that have this quandary, and I explain it to them. I don't know if this analogy helps in any way, shape, or form, but what I tell them is that you can break up the requirements in two sort of categories. There's the data center categories, and there's the data custodian categories. And I tell them that you are the custodian of your own data, and then the data center, your co-location, your cloud provider, your whatever, it doesn't matter. And there's probably a better word than data center, but I'm old. Are the ones that handle the systems. And so you've got to break it up. And this applies for any kind of shared responsibility, whether it's an application, whether it's whatever. So I don't know if that helps in any way, shape, or form, but that's what I use. People tend to get it if I tell them, just shut up, and it's broken up in a pie.
Yeah, there you go. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we look at it as cloud is actually empty data center. You still have to design, how am I going to network to it? Where's the data going to flow? How are we going to do ingress, egress inspections and all of those kind of things? But you don't automatically just get everything. You still have to design it and then apply the requirements according to the design.
No, cloud is magic. Don't you know that? Come on.
Solves all your problems.
Well,
You spin it up.
I thought it
it's
was
compliant,
funny.
I'm done.
I thought it was funny that Matt mentioned early on, Springfield, mentioned early on that the who controls the spend for service providers is sales. And I can remember some of my early encounters with customers that were starting to look at, and I don't mean to pick on them, but I am, AWS. And they would advertise on their website that they're PCI compliant, but if you could get your hands on the details, the T's and C's, they were pretty much saying, well, we're a hosting facility. Essentially, we're responsible for the racks and the power.
That's like the ISO. That's like the ISO 27001 people that they've been certified ISO 27001
right.
for one control.
Yeah.
Right. And but they would say, not necessarily in writing where you could go back to it, yeah, we're PCI compliant. Come on, host your stuff, bring it on. We'll take care of you. And it wasn't often until after you got on board and you started reading the small print that you would find out, okay, here's this long list of services that they do provide, can provide, will provide, don't provide. And that's not necessarily a consistent listing based on the PCI controls that you need to follow. So I guess, in terms of a pointed question, if I will, Matt, is there a rule of thumb on, just sort of the bare minimum out of the box, I'm moving something to the cloud? I mean, you've talked about where to look for it in terms of the shared responsibilities, but, out of the box, bare minimum, what most people are trying to spend as little as money as possible on, and because the allure of the cloud is to save money, which we also alluded to early on. Can you just broad strokes, what are you still responsible from a PCI perspective if you're an organization that's jumping onto the cloud bandwagon, as it were?
The number one approach needs to be that for the resources that you're moving into the cloud, ensure that exactly what you were alluding to earlier, Jeff, the list of services that I'm consuming are on the service provider's attestation of compliance, because that's the first place that the assessor is going to look. If you're using a cloud database service, that needs to be on there. If you're using a cloud load balancer that needs to be on there. So your application design for the resources that you're moving into the cloud, that needs to be cross-referenced with the compliant services for your cloud service provider. That's kind of step number one. And what you mentioned earlier, I've come across so many times to see that organizations have, I'm using Amazon and I'm compliant, but not all of their services that they offer are compliant. And so you have to get down to that service by service approach.
You know, I want to step in here, and I don't really get a chance to say this very often, but if you stick around with us for part 2 of today's episode, you know, dealing with the cloud security, the shared security and shared responsibility model is something that we've listed to be part of the next segment. You know, so if you want to know more about that, keep watching or watch the next segment as well to follow on with conversation. But in one of the articles, and I really want to pull this up. I know I'm jumping the gun here, so please don't beat me up. In one of the articles, the author points out that, and I quote, "We luxuriate in the notion that our data is somehow safe, looked after by the internet and cloud giants, so we build our trust up and up. But an inconvenient question appears: what happens when it all goes down?" Right? So if you're trusting a cloud provider, right, what do you do when it goes down?
So when you say go down, are you referring to going down in the sense of availability or going down in the sense of a security incident?
All the above. Mainly, it would be more pointed towards availability, but realistically, the answer is yes.
So it's to me, I think that's a fantastic topic in general, because it's like selling insurance, right? We all have to ensure that we're doing the things that we can to ensure not an accident doesn't happen. But then eventually when the accident does happen, you know, it becomes very much front of mind. Everybody gets religion at that point. So while I know that there have been publicized smaller breaches that have been occurring with service providers, it's interesting to see you don't really hear a lot about the major service providers having major breaches yet. And I say yet because it's just a matter of time. But the question is what happens at that point? I think that goes into the liability discussion that Jeff alluded to earlier as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's nuanced, but I think part of that sales message that people often get, and I don't know if it originates from the salespeople, but there's certainly a perception that I've seen promoted that it's better, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, it's better to put your resources, your data, your assets out in the cloud, out in the fill in the blank, let's say, because that company, that's all they do. That company focuses on providing that service, and they're dedicated to security, and they're dedicated to availability and operations, keeping everything up and running. They have infinitely more resources than little old you that's struggling just to keep up. And I can't say that that's completely true. And yes, we've not had, you know, major publicly announced breaches and compromises that we know about, but from my pen testing days, and even, dare I say, from working for a company that dabbles in this loud host, you know, providing of services, you know, the reality is more often, you know, they're just barely keeping things together, if for no other reason than just the scale, the enormity of the data that they're handling, and the assets for all the different customers that they're handling. It's just overwhelming or near overwhelming. All that to say is, I think it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, and it's probably sales putting the pressure on the business. So marketing puts a beautiful little PCI marketing spin around it so the sales guys can keep selling, Jeff.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not so much true these days, though, but I swear, you know, in the early days, you know, and arguably the cloud goes back 20 some odd years, but let's say in the last 10 years, I've certainly seen sales messages, marketing messages that allude to the "come on over," come to Candy Mountain. Everything is safe. Everything is happy. And all I could tell my customers back in those days was just read the small print. Know what you're signing up for, because I don't think you're getting what you think you're getting. So buyer beware.
Magic. Chocolate fountains, magic.
Isn't it Candy Mountain? What's that old video from the early days of the internet with the dancing unicorn or whatever?
Oh, Charlie the unicorn.
Yeah, Charlie, come to Candy Mountain. Isn't it Candy Mountain?
Charlie.
Somebody Google it. Somebody will drop it in the Discord server.
Yeah, it's already there.
Faster than we can Google it.
Awesome. Anyway, I digress. But so Matt, we've sort of discussed a lot of things. If you could summarize, do's, don'ts, things. What are the things that you absolutely need to look out for? Just to try to sum up your advice for companies and organizations that are considering any level of migration of anything that they have to the cloud.
Yeah, I would say, as we've talked about before, start with the AOC, talk to your cloud service provider. Each one, most of them are actually publishing their AOCs online right now. You may have to sign up. You may have to be like a customer. But as a part of the sales process, you can absolutely work with your salesman to get a copy of the AOC. Cross-reference that with the services that you are looking to put out there. And then sit down and understand and know that you need to have both a technical design and an operational design or an operational plan for what it is that you're wanting to do. So if we're going to move applications to the cloud, what services are they using? How are they compliant? And then how do we operate that environment moving long term? How are we dealing with segmentation changes? How are we changing firewall rules in the cloud? Work with your own internal teams to make sure that you have a plan for that. Lifecycle management is still very important, especially if you're doing VMs. Patching, still very important. Not necessarily applicable to all cloud services, but sure can be impactful. So it's having that plan, making sure you're compliant, and then work with your QSA and know that you got to document all that.
Two quick questions pointedly, because these are the things that the hacker security side of the world focus on. Vulnerability scanning or vulnerability management, and then the idea of penetration testing. Who typically is responsible for each of those if you an organization are moving any amount of your operations into the cloud? So
that goes into the shared responsibility model that we were talking about earlier. So for the infrastructure that exists basically below the data plane, think of any services that are provided, database services, caching services, queuing services, network services, all of those things that are owned by the CSP, the cloud service provider. It's going to be their responsibility to handle all that. If your organization is deploying virtual machines into networks and virtual networks, VNets and things of that nature, it'll be the merchant or the consumer's responsibility. So if you're a merchant or service provider that are consuming these services, it'll be on you to provide that level of scanning and pen testing for that infrastructure.
Great. Thank you for that clarification, because I know I've had several customers and one of my current customers right now is we had to point that out to them because they thought, oh, doesn't the provider do all of that for us? And we had to kind of spell it out to them. So it's the message is not always effectively conveyed before this ink is signed or dried. Appreciate the conversation, Matt. We're going to take a quick break, come back, and you've already had a sneak preview thanks to Scott. We're going to talk on some of the security and compliance news as it focuses on cloud security and cloud hosting. Funny how those are the topics of news segments even within the last day and hours, if not week. So stay tuned. We'll be back in just a few minutes.